Hi guys and welcome to Comic Sphere hosted by SOUNDSPHERE magazine. This week I chat with Kelley Jones, who is primarily known for his extensive work with DC Comics on characters such as Deadman, Swamp Thing, Batman and the Sandman. We discuss his career, how he got into comics professionally, and the episodes of Netflix's The Sandman based on his work. Check it out. Hello Kelley, how are you doing?
Very good, Graham. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. Yeah, how is it in California?
It's a nice warm day in Northern California, but August, you kind of can already tell this year, this time of the year, it's starting to smell like fall already.
Nice
You
time
know,
of
it's
year though,
nice.
isn't it? Yeah.
It's nice. Yeah, it's been a nice cool summer, so it's okay.
Oh, we've had a major heat wave in the UK.
Yeah, see, here we're used to about 110, 100, that's what we normally get, but it's been like 90s. So everyone, it's like it's almost like winter for us Californians.
Wow. Right. First thing I wanted to ask you was, how did you initially get into being a comics artist?
Uh, I always enjoyed drawing a lot. I love comic books. I loved all that kind of stuff then. And never really thought of doing it. I mean, back then there was no real way to connect other than at a convention or something. And though I was at a convention, I didn't go there with that intention. I went there to get, comics signed and whatnot, find old comics and whatever. And a friend of mine took some of my artwork. I was probably 16 years old, and he took some of my artwork, and he without telling me, we were in line to get comics uh, signed by Marshall Rogers, who was uh, had just done detective run on Batman, or Batman run on detective. So he, without telling me, just sort of said, "Hey, what do you think of my friend's art?" And I had thought he had comic books in the satchel or something. And I just froze because that's not what my intent was. And I wasn't really drawing comic book pages. I was drawing like, monsters and all that kind of crap. And I had already seen Marshall Rogers, not being mean, but pretty much tell people who had shown stuff that they had a long way to go, or that it wasn't worth they weren't at that point where they should be showing stuff. They still had a long way to go. And but he was very kind about it. And that's what so but still, I mean, I was just sitting there thinking, I'm glad I did not bring anything. And he took a look, and he stopped for a moment, and he said, "Do you have a few minutes? I'd like to talk to you." And I didn't know if he was going, at that point, you're not thinking, "Oh, good." You're thinking, "Oh, now he's really gonna take it apart." He's got to sit down to take it apart and stop this whole thing.
Yeah.
Still, I was not thinking, "Yeah, I want to do this at all." I didn't even know how you did it, right? I had no clue. And he sat me down and spent about 20 minutes telling me what he liked, telling me what I need to work on. He thought he drew a few little sketches for me on how to figure out how to do a human body proportionally. He took a page and showed me how to. In fact, if you give me a second here. This is the page that he physically was showing me how to do comics on. Now, I didn't buy it at the time. I didn't have the money. This was a gigantic sum of $250
Wow.
back in 78 or 79. And so and here, if you can see on the back, I don't know if you can, that's the little drawing he did of how to proportion a body.
Wow.
Okay. So he like I said, he would go like this. He'd say, well, here you can see the motion of the Trump, and he would explain stuff, how everything was set up. This would be here for this reason. And he just was wonderful, right? All pure impact. And it told the story. He says, if you get the story as it goes. So I walked out of there, and he told me the last thing he said was, I think if you really stick to this, you have your own kind of thing going on, but if you stick to this, I think one day maybe you would do a really standout Batman. I never thought of doing comics, never thought of Batman. It still didn't become my goal because you don't think that way. But it changed my point of focus on maybe I should put some more effort in this, meaning more time. I did a lot of other things at that time. So I spent more time doing it, and I would say about 3 years later, DC or Marvel and DC kind of were starting to look for new talent. DC put out a thing where you show a new tryout thing, and Marvel did a send in your samples. We want to see. And through that, Marvel got about 20,000 samples, and they hired about 3 or 4 people out of it. And I happened to be lucky enough to be one of those. And I started as an inker, and I was an inker for about a year, and then Butch Geist was the artist I was inking on the Micronauts, and he left. And of all people, they chose me to take over. And they had liked my samples in the penciling that I'd sent in, but I hadn't really drawn anything in not comic book wise. I drew pictures, but I went in as an inker. That's what I thought I would be. And they said, we will teach you as you go. And I drew out of the gate, I drew about 20, 30 issues of Micronauts, not knowing what I was doing, completely without a net, but it was the best training ever. Learn how to meet deadlines, learn how to tell a story, learn how to work with a colorist and a letterer, and all the things you have to do. So it was an industrial training, and I was 20 years old or so when they hired me. So I didn't know anything. And in those days, they really, really taught. So, I mean, that's a long story, but it is this odd journey. I only say it because it should give hope to people that you don't have to follow. There isn't a real path the way you think there will be, even if the technology changes and everything. It was a series of flukes, and I'm not even going to bore everyone with the someone happened to see something at some. It's just weird, but if people like your stuff, they don't care where you went to school, they don't care where you're from, they don't care anything. They just see the fact that they like it and it potentially could sell.
Wow. I must confess, I did know the Marshall Rogers story, but I was not expecting you to pull the page out.
Yeah. Well, Marshall was probably sympathetic because he had a very odd way of getting into the industry too.
Yeah.
So, and he kind of came late to the game as far as it was considered then. I think I don't know if I came in later or not, but Marshall was very different. So he probably was sympathetic to what he saw with me, because I didn't, like I said, I wasn't bringing in comic book art. I was just, and I really, in my samples, did a little bit of that, but primarily it was just to show I could ink different textures and ink different atmospheres and things like that, daytime, nighttime, that kind of stuff, underwater, all that stuff where you show off kind of what you can do. So when they first sent me a script, that was the first time. I think at the end of 2 weeks, that was the most comic book pages I had ever drawn. And I really owed it a lot to my editor then, who was Ralph Macchio, who just held my hand through the whole thing.
And how did you progress from Micronauts over to eventually doing the Nightfall covers?
Well, what I had wasn't probably a great technical skill because I didn't take any art courses per se. I took film courses, but what I did have was a lot of ideas and a lot of things I loved. I loved old horror films. I loved old film noir uh, films. So those ideas, as my abilities got better, those ideas started becoming stronger and stronger. And frankly, back then, and I loved horror, but you really couldn't find it then other than Alan Moore and Steve Bissette on Swamp Thing. I've got a bunch of them in my house, so it's okay. Um, uh, and so I knew there wouldn't be a place for horror, but I still was becoming more and more entranced by doing those kind of themes. The funny thing was Marvel was giving me more penciling things, but they weren't letting me ink myself, and they were keeping me in licensing. I wanted to try to do some other things. I was lucky enough and got to do Comet Man, which had different elements to it, but they wouldn't let me ink myself, which was, like I said, ironic since I had started as an inker. But they probably thought deadline wise it would slow you down and that whole thing. So when DC had gotten a hold of me, I'd been 6 years at Marvel doing very well, but not very satisfied. I wasn't getting, I guess it's like actors who you want that one part or something. And I wasn't so much looking for a horror story or anything like it. I was just looking for something they'd let me ink. And they gave me Deadman in these little backups to try just to see how it worked, me working at DC and how they would like it. And again, they wouldn't let me ink myself because that was under a very tight deadline. But when it had been successful and they offered me Deadman as a prestige series, my only stipulation was, yes, I will, but you have to build into it that I get to ink myself. I mean, I have to ink myself now because I knew that even though my penciling looked really different and they liked it, the inks would be very different. It would, there's no way I could indicate that stuff to an inker. It wasn't that there weren't good inkers. I do a lot of drawing with my brush and my tools. A lot of drawing, even if it's fully penciled, there's a lot of things I do. And I love mistakes. I like things that happen that go wrong and you incorporate it. There's an energy to that. That's too artsy fartsy for commercial comics. But if you're doing it and fast enough, you can stay a little artsy fartsy. And so I've always felt I started in comics in 82, but I really started in like 88 when I got to do what I wanted to do. That I always looked at my period at Marvel then is going to school. I was learning how to do it. I was learning the rules, seeing if I physically could do it. When someone says you got 20 some odd pages to get done in 2 weeks, they don't care. It's like your life does not matter. So, and all of your problems don't matter, and you just have to get it done. And hopefully it's good and you don't embarrass yourself. But when they gave me Deadman, that opened every door because nobody had seen anything like it. And that's when I knew all those ideas that have been percolating in my head were valid. Those ideas were for me. I never thought, well, people will love this. I always thought, man, I'll love this, Yeah. And as time went on, that's always a double-edged sword because if you don't look like everybody else, you tend to, you're the odd man out. But on the other hand, if you only look like yourself, you're the only guy they can call. And you have a better chance of kind of standing out. And luckily, Deadman made me get noticed. That led to Sandman, that led to Batman, Swamp Thing, everything since. Those books are still in print from those years because I think that oddly enough, they're even more unique now than they were then. And that's rare.
I think when you look back at Deadman, obviously you've got your classic Neil Adams type, and then almost everyone after Neil Adams did, a sort of replica of Neil Adams type of. Apart from you, yours was completely different. Like, well, after he'd been on it a while, he started getting skinny and like a lot more horror, and
Yeah.
it was beautiful and very, very different.
Well, what happens is that everybody, you just said it, everybody was doing Neil.
Yeah,
And Neil, you can't really compete with that. On the other hand, it just seemed like one of those things that I kind of tried to do it that way. I didn't know what they wanted. They just gave me the story. But when I read it, it was not him fighting a villain to do typical superhero things. It was a horror story. So that helped. Mike Maron did not write a traditional, you know, he's going to stop a bank robbery thing. It was ghosts that he was going to go fight. And I thought, okay, that would lend me a little more room to do this and try this. Now, I didn't ask their permission. I didn't ask anything. I figured if my ideas are good, and it struck me as a good idea, they'll like it. If they say no way, okay, I'm out. But you have to at that point take a risk. And it just started to flow out of me. It was not there was no problem to it. And when you have real joy in what you're doing, it doesn't matter. I became more immune. I didn't sit on pins and needles waiting for him to say, hey, we hate this. I knew it was good. I knew that whatever it takes to do comics, that's the first time I really felt I had what it took. And when they came back and said, yes, we do like it, and you get to ink yourself, that was the best. Then I knew I can if I allow for that and don't overthink it, just let it happen like that. Deadman just seemed like a natural. He doesn't really do anything, he just sort of floats around and inhabits other people. So when he's using his power, you don't see him. So I had to make him as visually interesting as possible. And I thought to the grotesque was in keeping with his name. And it would also add a ton of atmosphere to the story. Sometimes you have to take over a character and act as if you invented it. Not scrap what the prior people did or ignore someone like Neil Adams. You don't. But you have to act like you did it yourself, or no one will remember 30 years later.
Well, obviously everyone remembers
I was
30
lucky.
years ago.
It's a thing where you're lucky. And when you do that, it does get you noticed. I always tell people coming into it, especially artists, it's okay for someone not to like what you do, as long as you are really if you're sincerely putting your all into it. If somebody doesn't like it, it means you're still communicating to them. It's still working, if that makes sense. It sounds ironic, but it means it's working. Those people, for the most part, will come around because that sincerity will come through. It's shocking when you look at something as gorgeous as what Neil was doing to what I was doing. There's no comparison to the absolute beauty of Neil Adams' graceful look to it, and then my looking like he clawed himself out of a grave. But they work. And Neil himself had always been very supportive and very, very much impressed with that. He had said that was it solved the problem of him. Everyone was just doing him, which is understandable. I mean, it took a long time for people to break from Kirby or from Ditko because they became pretty iconic on it. But with me, I had nothing to lose. And I came to Deadman not saying, oh, I got Deadman. I wanted Deadman my whole life. It was like, I have all these ideas in me and they're driving me nuts. And it's almost like you're meditating. And I don't meditate, but from what friends of mine who do, that I'm not aware of drawing when I'm drawing. It just sort of does its thing. I don't mean that to sound pretentious the way it does. It's just you really get into it. And probably like someone who's doing music or something, it just sometimes these things happen. And that's what was so difficult in my career before I got to do work at DC, was all these ideas and they had nowhere to go. And one of the the solutions to comics is develop. If you can develop ideas, that's where style comes from. It isn't looking at somebody else and taking this part and looking at this thing you like and adding that part. It's the sheer force of the ideas that start making these things happen. I mean, it totally influenced my career once I was able to let that happen.
One of the things I've noticed a lot of people praise you for is, and I think it comes from when you've studied filmmaking rather than art school or whatever. It's you've got a very unique way of telling a story, and sometimes it'll be a bit unorthodox. And I remember there's one panel where is it a keyhole or a socket or something, and you're looking out and you see someone putting something into it. I remember that. It's quite unorthodox, quite unusual, but it really, really works, and it's something that you get celebrated for.
Well, it comes from everybody's seen everything before, and I don't like wasted panels. If it's a guy plugging in a socket and I know what you're talking about, that's a panel then designed to hold a balloon. It's like, I'm going to do this thing.
Yeah.
And it lended atmosphere to the way I did Batman, that it's a totally different way of doing these things. Also, I think fundamentally it slows people down to read the story. Like, okay, that stops them for a minute to figure it out. If I can get 9 out of 10 times people going, oh, that's interesting, then I've done my job. And then it adds something, because I know that in a more gothic turn on Batman, it will stand out. It will be remembered, good or bad. And it becomes its own thing. And that is really what the fun of it is. I mean, I don't do it thinking all those things when I'm doing. I just went, well, how can I do this a little differently that's interesting, right? Maybe add a little more tension. How can I do this to slow people down? Or how can a lot of storytelling, since comics have no sound, I like a very still ambiguous panel sometimes that relates directly to what's going on, but may stop someone to look at it for a second and just add to that atmosphere. Batman is really where you can do it the most.
Yeah. Obviously, your Batman run was one of the most celebrated I would say, probably of all time. One of the biggest ones in the 90s, and obviously you had your Nightfall covers up until then. Then you had your run with Doug Mensch.
Right.
How did all that come to be?
Well, I had done Batman Dracula with Doug, and I thought that would be, that would be it, because I didn't see myself as a Batman artist. I saw it as a horror story with Batman in it. So I was going to go back to what I had known when that was finished. I'd gotten those because the inker Malcolm Jones was inking me on Sandman, and he had been working with Doug, and that led to Red Rain. After that, I figured, okay, I'll go back to working for Karen Berger and doing. I was gunning for Swamp Thing if they would let me do it. And out of the blue, Denny O'Neil calls and said, would you like to, I need a couple covers. And I said, oh man, that would be great. Sure. They also asked if I knew Sam Keith or had connection to Sam Keith. And I said, yeah. And so they went and got Sam to do Detective, me to do Batman. And Sam did a few, and they were wonderful. But Sam called me one day and said, I'm having trouble with this. And he came over and he was telling me he just felt like he was freezing up, and it was getting later and later. And so I kept telling DC, don't worry, because they were saying, what's going on? What's going on? I said, do not worry. Sam will come through. He's just, he's working this out. It's sometimes you will freeze on things. And you're right, and it just doesn't come. Long story short, he can't do it. He calls me up. He says, I just can't do it. DC's now not happy with me because I had been saying, don't worry, don't worry. So they said, okay, basically the way for me to make that up to them was to do the covers that Sam was going to do. And that's all it was going to be. I had like 2 or 3 of his covers to do and the ones I'd been hired. It wasn't like they said, Kelley, come and do Batman and Detective and do Nightfall. It evolved into that. So I sat down and spent a week knocking out these covers to make up time. They were very happy that I got them done. They were happy that they made deadline, and the best part was they liked what they saw. I thought that was the end of it. And I go back to what I was doing. They at that point, Danny's assistant then was Scott Peterson, and he says, you know, Danny's put me in charge of this. I really like kind of what happened here. So if you would, I'd like you to do Batman and Detective. We've started this thing called Nightfall or whatever they were doing. I didn't know anything about it. I was involved in my own stuff, Bloodstorm and Aliens and all kinds of other things. So I didn't really know the story too much, but they would just get a hold of me and say, you know, Batman's fighting this guy, Batman's doing this. They weren't really sure themselves because those stories were, you know, it was Alan Grant, Doug mentioned Chuck Dixon round robbing this thing. And so it was changing all the time. And so my covers then, which lends to me personally how I like to think, were ambiguous. I guessed at what was going on, and no one was there to tell me yes or no. They just, all I was told was it's, you know, they'd call on a Monday, kind of give me a short description of what they think they wanted, and it was due in the office by Wednesday. So I would have roughly that day and the next until no scanners to send it, so it had to be in a FedEx box. So really, if they said Wednesday, they meant Tuesday. So that's how it worked.
Yeah.
And because of those early 6 years at Marvel, I knew how to focus, but I thrived on that. I thrived on kind of the adventure and the excitement of a disaster could happen at any moment. I look at it now and I can see where it was easy. I could see where, okay, that was one that I had to fudge on. That, I mean, I can tell even after all this time. But those went over so well. Again, I never saw the monthly title coming to me, and neither did Doug Mensch. That was Denny O'Neil. And Denny wanted something different after all of the crossover books and tied together books and big event books. He thought it would be cool if there was this, because he would see what I was doing on the vampire books, and he thought that was really, really cool. And it was very gothic Batman, and very, even though he's a vampire in it, I didn't really draw him all nuts until a panel here or a panel there. Generally, it was just Batman doing Batman things. And he's the one who made the call. He didn't talk to his assistant editors. He didn't talk to Doug. He didn't talk to anyone about what it was he wanted. He kept his own counsel. He called me up, and at that point, that was when he asked me, I thought all the others did know. I thought the assistants knew. I thought Doug knew. And they were genuinely shocked that, one, Denny did this without asking, and that he chose me. Not like it's an insult. It's just that is so different. Even for them, that was different. And I never had a lot of direction from Denny, other than he always would say, go further with what you're doing. Don't worry about, just keep going further. He was like a shield then, because I did draw very differently. I look back now and I go, oh my God. You know, it's like, because then there was no, you didn't see anything till the things came out. I didn't know what other people were doing too much. And there was no, you know, the only media had was little pamphlets DC or Marvel put out saying, here's what's coming up. That was it. Maybe you saw some people at conventions. If you're on a monthly, you can't go to conventions. So I didn't see anything. And you know, I remember when the reprint came out, the hardcover reprint came out, I think in 2012 or 14 or something like that. It shocked me. Just like everybody else probably was shocked when they saw it. And I went, wow, but I liked it. I don't go back and look at my stuff, and I don't know it inside out and backwards. But when I look through it just to see how it printed, it really surprised me. And I got to tell Denny before he passed that that was a really kind thing. And he was like saying, I wanted that. You know, he says that was one of the high marks on, he says, in my career, I always like to say I put Kelley Jones on Batman. And which is a staggering thing from someone like that to say to you. If he'd have said all that stuff, Graham, at the beginning, I'd have froze up and said, no, go back to my little horror area and felt comfortable. But since I was blissfully ignorant, and I was just making myself happy that day, I was like, oh, that's a cool shot, or oh, that's a pretty good little scene there, or something like that. I was working with John Beatty, and John Beatty was such a good inker, and so that's the only, my only feedback was my inker, who would say this is really good. And then I had a nice thing once, got a note through editorial from Todd Klein, the editor, saying, hey, I really, really like what you're doing on Batman. You're not repeating yourself. This is different. So people who were in this, who see everything, were telling me these really good kind of attaboys. And you know, no one's saying, oh, you're the greatest thing and you've reinvented comics. They were just saying, this is different. I haven't seen this, and it looks good to me. And there's nobody else doing this. There's been nobody before. There's nobody now doing it. So, but again, if all those things are being said to you, you freeze up. I don't work well that way, but I do work well when you're just left to your own devices, and these unforeseen good things start to happen. Never did I figure the cape would be long. Never did I think the ears would be this way. Never did I think all that. I didn't think any of that. It all sort of evolved as it went.
But it all works so beautifully.
Yeah.
It's like, I know some people don't like the long ears, and
Yeah, they don't.
But it's fine, whatever. Yeah,
because
it's beautiful.
And it didn't, and thank you. It didn't come from, I'm going to draw him with big ears. It came from, I need him to be a really frightening shadow, or a frightening silhouette. I was thinking of him in the dark. I never think of Batman in the daytime or in a well-lit situation. He would probably look ridiculous then, but in the dark, it would be frightening. And the cape came from the fact that I thought, you know, if you heard that rustling and it's moving and you can't really define his shape, that would be frightening. So, which is what he's all about, is being frightening. If he has to get physical, it's kind of a failure to me. If he can intimidate you into stopping, okay. So again, that's the ideas, and that's the thing that I truly live for. I still live for that in comics, is if I can come up with an angle that is satisfying to me, not for just the sake of it, but one that propels me through a day, through a job. Then it quits being a job and it's a wonderful experience. And if it is for me, hopefully it is for someone picking it up. Again, I've never, ever been upset if someone doesn't like it, because we're all different and everyone has a way of what they think. But what I think I get more than other artists do is I get people who will change their mind. I give them something to change their mind over. And then you become, because I've had a number of editors hire me, Graham, who said, oh man, I hated the long ears, or I didn't understand it, or whatever. Then they would say, yours is the one Batman though that I really dug. After I got used to it, I went, this is what comics are. I had one editor tell me he got out of comics until he saw these on the stands, and it brought him back into comics, because he felt, well, if they can do this, then the stuff I would want to see, I may get to do. And he did. So it, that's more than just having a style. Those are ideas.
Yeah, I totally understand what you mean. I think if I'm going to be completely honest, the first time I picked up one of your Batman books,
Yep.
I looked at it and I thought, I don't think I'm going to like this.
Yes.
And I don't like admitting it, but I thought the exact same thing with Tim Sale as well. Bless
Yep.
him.
No.
I looked at it and I thought, I don't think I'm going to, but I'll read it. And completely fell in love and never looked back. And,
that's the experience that every comic book artist wants. And that's the exact same experience I had when I first read Bernie Wrightson Swamp Thing. I don't think I'm going to like this.
Yeah.
And the first time I didn't, but it stayed in my head and I had to go back and look again, like the forbidden thing that it had become. The second time, I not only loved it, I went and learned his name, and then I went and tried to find everything. At that point, it was 70s, and just he became the guy I would just go look at. Marshall Rogers was that way for me. At first, I didn't know what to make of him, and this was before he did Batman. So, and then it's Doug Minch told me it was the shock of the change. He says when somebody does something and you're going, oh, I'm not used to that. But I've since learned that's the biggest compliment you can get.
I'll tell you a very quick story before we move on. I recently showed, yours and Doug's run is in the 2 hardcovers.
Right.
I showed the first hardcover to my 9-year-old son, and he was scared of it. He was scared of the cover, just the cover.
I hear a lot of that from people will say, when I was a kid, that scared me. When your covers are these Batman, they scared me. And that is just music to my heart. because that's what happened to me. I would look at comic books that would like unnerve me just looking at the picture. And that's when you realize you have a power. The intent isn't so much to scare children, but it is to get a response that, hey, something different's happening here. I've never forgotten that comics are meant for kids. I still draw thinking a kid's looking at this, even if it's a fairly explicit thing or a fairly raw situation. And I also think in terms that I want my comics to still look really comic-y. I don't want them. It's not like I'm stuck in a nostalgia loop. It's that I think it's the only place you get to see this. I don't want my comics to look like adverts. I don't want my comics to look like slick illustration. I don't want that. I want them to have a grit and a power of a comic book, of brush inking or pen inking, of these really strong lines, of this really personal rendering that I knew from artists growing up, where I felt they got across to me better, because I can get realism anywhere else. Absolutely get it everywhere else on an overload. But in comics, I want exaggeration and I want interesting. I want and comics needs to always exploit. This is the only place you can get this, our industry was built. This whole industry was built on Jack Kirby, who was as different as to this day. I want to say abstract. I would say the same thing about Steve Ditko, completely abstract. And those guys it flowed from them. Comics were dead until those guys came in there and did what they did. And in fact, the beauty is Marvel wasn't even the best sellers in the 60s. DC still dominated everything. But what Marvel did was they took the high ground of art and they changed it from what it was to what it is now. And I think sadly, though, it's kind of got away from like I said, these guys were monthly artists. So that was my big thing, was these were monthly dudes. They weren't going off and doing something and then coming to you and showing it to you or just doing a couple issues. They were kicking butt every month. And that can only happen if you are just swimming with ideas. Technical skill means nothing if the ideas are great.
I think it's always interesting if you compare a page of Ditko Spider-Man with a page of Ditko Doctor Strange.
Yeah.
You at first glance you wouldn't know it was the same people.
Yeah.
But because it like Doctor Strange is completely abstract and fantasy and craziness, and and Spider-Man.
Well, Ditko was showing you that he was thinking that one is a book on magic, and Spider-Man was an extraordinary thing in a realistic setting, and he did that. He didn't let his style dictate the terms. He let his ideas dictate the terms.
Speaking of magic, we have to mention Sandman.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do.
I've not actually seen the new episode yet, but I've heard about it. I'm really, really looking forward to reading it. That the issue it's based on is one of my favorites. I am a cat person. You may have noticed when
I am too, and I know where you're going. Yeah.
So tell me about your experience working with Neil Gaiman.
Well, we were very young back then, and we were both making our name. And he was just getting the ball rolling, and I was just getting the ball rolling. And I think we both had chips on our shoulder about, in a good way, of wanting to present who we were on our own terms. Sandman was kind of a cult book then.
Yeah.
It was doing okay, but it wasn't. It was for the people on the peripheral fandom of comics. There's the center part that's Batman, Avengers, all that stuff, and then there's out there in Pluto are the Swamp Thing and Sandman and those things. When they got a hold of me, it was to do Calliope, because that was considered, and rightfully so, a horror story. And I had just come off for Karen Berger doing, she'd seen what I've been doing on Deadman, and she saw I did a Swamp Thing with her that they liked quite a bit. So Neil had seen it and said to Karen, I'm going to do these single episodic stories, one shots. I would like to see if you could get Kelley to do this one because it's a pretty creepy story. And they gave it to me, and it came off very successfully. I was very experimental in it, and I got to utilize storytelling in a way that it's a pretty rough story. So I didn't want anything erotic to it or anything. And Karen, who was editing it, I was aware I'm working for a woman on a story of a very abusive situation. But I didn't let that deter me and hamper me. So I went and did what I did. Neil was very impressed with that issue. So was Karen, because I handled it in a way they felt. Absolutely got it across, but I didn't do anything gruesome. That would have changed it, and it wouldn't have been as interesting. I think your mind does worse. So I wasn't slated to do the cat issue. That was I was on to other things. But Neil had gotten had overcome a terrible writer's block, and Calliope was the one that broke that. So he was way behind. And so the cat story was something he had in mind because he wanted to get across Sandman's impact is beyond just human. Cat's dream, right? So he's got to be involved in that. And nobody wanted the story. And everyone they were offering didn't want to draw cats for 22 pages, And I didn't know any of this. It was just Karen called me up and said, I know it's a really tight deadline. I know, but the story's about cats. And as soon as she said, I would understand if you don't want to do it. I've asked 4 or 5 people, and she named them, and they didn't want to do it. I said, I got it. It's mine. Send it. I'll do it. And she says, well, Neil's still writing it, but I'll tell him you're on board. And I said, okay. About a week later, the script comes. Um, I was kicking myself because it was all cats. And I had to draw cats. But it was so powerful. When I read the thing, it was so good. And like you, I have cats. So I just, at that time I had one cat, and I just used him. He was Sandcat, and he was, I used him just for everything. And I had pictures from when he was a kitten. So I had a lot of, as I knew how to draw, but draw cats, but uh, Neil was right. Every cat had to be kind of different. So I had to go look at different kinds. I had friends' cats. I went and bought a Cat Fancy magazine to go look at different cats. And those people, if comic book people are weird, we're nothing compared to the Cat Fancy people. So, but it came out absolutely. I knew. I called him up almost every 3 or 4 days. I'd say, Neil, this is going to be such a big book. I can tell you, this is the one. This is the one you can just show to people, right? You don't even have to say you know all the lore and know all the history and any explanation. You just say, this is why I like Sandman. And he was taken with that. When that book came out, uh, I went to go, I had, there was a small chain of comic book stores out here called Comics and Comics. And they had some in the San Francisco area. They had some in Sacramento. They had some in Oakland. They're all in that area. And so a friend of mine who ran it said, "Would you do a little signing for uh, Sandman? You're doing the Sandman. You did Dead Man." And I went. When I went, it was like uh, I had not seen a reaction to just not just fans, but I mean people who are hardcore. We've seen it all on that issue. And it was exactly what I had told him was happening. People were handing it to others and saying, you got to read this. Even if you don't, this is why I like it. I think the only time I ever saw that prior in my experience was Frank Miller's Daredevil. When Frank Miller was doing Daredevil, people were doing that. They would say, I know you comics are still, just read this one.
Yeah.
And they would be turned on to what Frank was doing on Daredevil. And I had told Neil that. I said, I think that's the only other time I've seen that. Those had done so well. At that point, Neil called me up and said, Karen's going to call you because you're the guy to do Seasons of Mist after those 2 issues. And he sent me like an outline of what it kind of was. He didn't, it was a work in progress, but it was what he called it was his Sgt. Pepper's run. It will be the Sgt. Pepper's album of Sandman comics. Because it was really setting the tone. He had worked 2 years to get to it. He had hoped against hope that it wouldn't be canceled so he could get to it, which he's going through now. He's waiting for the show to get renewed to do Seasons of Mist. But the cat issue was one that I was hearing, and I still hear from people who aren't into comics. That may not, but that issue really gets to them. And it's a hard issue. But it's emotionally one of the most satisfying things you read. When you come to the end, it is so satisfying. And a lot of people try to shield themselves from emotions nowadays rather than and they're affected by the world so much. And I find that what Neil does so well is he lets you in a comic book feel those emotions. So when you really do have something happen, you're kind of ready for it. You're kind of, you have something that it's like exercise. You got to sometimes use a muscle or you'll lose it. You got to run your car or you'll lose it. And I think that's what's even more important in art or literature. And certainly the cat issue is one of those things that there's some rough stuff in it. Calliope had some rough stuff, but it's worthy material. It transcends good and evil in that sense. It's what we feel, it's what we do, it's how the most angry I've ever heard people about something is the guy who drowns the kittens. I always hear, man, just kill him. And I go, yes, that's the feeling, but it's the moment that makes the prophet do what she does. And
If a story,
everyone,
sorry, go
yeah,
on.
no, it's just, that's a necessary thing. You can't just say one day they didn't give me my cat food the way I wanted.
Yeah,
One day they didn't let me in on a cold day. It has to be something that we ourselves would feel. I give Neil an enormous amount of credit because I thought when he wrote Calliope, he was really shredding creative people, you know,
yeah.
that basically were users of other people's lives. And that's what he was talking about. He was talking about himself and everybody else he knew, that you hear something and you go, oh, that's awful. Did that really happen? And then you write it down.
I
I
think
could use that.
I think if a story can affect you emotionally in that sort of way, it's no longer just a story; it's an experience. And I
I
think,
do this for a
yeah,
living, and those stories stayed with me my whole career. I still think about them. And that is not because I worked on them. Like anything great, they stayed with me. And uh, I have always joked with my wife, who was there when I was doing it. I said, we got to be nice to them or they'll dream that dream. That was an in joke in the fan. Now everybody gets it, right? That was the thing. And you better get up and feed them because they'll dream that dream. And then they'll be doing this to us, you know? So, but it just became, and that's hard to do. That's hard to enter into a public discourse that way. But it only comes if something matters. So when I hear people say, well, Calliope was rough, even then, or the cat, I go, you need to emotionally get into that and let it, it's not really happening, but let Neil's magic work over you. And when it comes to the end of these stories, they're so satisfying. They never go away. Like anything really good, they do not go away.
yeah,
Um, and Neil doesn't serve it up in a way that, there's no way to know where these are going. When you first read them, you have no idea where they're going. And when you get to the point where you come to that conclusion, you find there's no other way but this way to do it. I will give him that. And though when they aired, I remember he got a hold of me and he said, we're working on these. And this was several months ago, and we're not telling anyone, so don't tell anyone. But they showed me some of what they were doing, and it was shocking. And the cat one felt like when that book was coming out again. It was like, wow, uh, beautifully done. Uh, I didn't know how they would. When he said we're doing Dream, I said, well, how are you going to do that? And he says, you know, uh, they came and said we want to animate it, and I went, that's how you do it. That is how you do it. I was thinking, is this going to look like a cat food commercial with talking? I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how you do that, but animated is the way to do it. And to me, it was in a fabulous series. It's a standout, just like it was 30 some odd years ago. And
yeah.
I don't say that because of my involvement. I felt that way when I got those scripts. I felt Calliope had such an edge because he was tearing himself apart. And as a writer, the biggest fear Neil had was no ideas, and he'd just come off that. And then what writers do, and I've heard Stephen King say it, and I've heard other writers say it, that they sometimes have to realize, don't be a ghoul, but they are. I mean,
Yeah.
any creative person, I'm that way. You just see things and you go, oh, that'll be good. Can't tell anyone that but it just goes into this flat file in your head. And God bless Neil for those were courageous then, they're courageous now.
It's an exciting time to be a Neil Gaiman fan.
I think he probably has worried over this more than anything because it's what he built his name on. And it's the closest to his heart. And comics are closest to our heart. There just are. And it's why it's so unique. And it's why I tell people, let's stay comic book guys. Let's not be movie or TV guys. If they want to adapt, fine. I'm all for that. But we still keep doing what we're doing. And I think he waited until the right time. I think he took good counsel from other people at DC, Karen Berger, until the right thing could come along. Don't shove it all. It turned out to be fortunate. Why shove it into one movie? Streaming is the best way to do it.
Absolutely, yeah.
So it all was good fortune. But I think he's look. When I first saw Dream, I don't think I've been as happy, not in a personal sense that way, but that it did what it did then.
Yeah.
It did the same thing. Oh, you're not into Sandman? Just watch this episode. You don't have to know the history of Sandman. You don't have to know it. And then people got into it again, or you brought new people in. And because I saw Sandman when I did Seasons of Mist, it went from maybe selling at the local store about 40 copies a month to 600. And it was doing X-Men numbers for them because Seasons just exploded. And there's at that point, I give all the credit to Karen Berger and Neil Gaiman because that was their baby, their idea. She fought to keep that thing on the stands, and that is comics history. It was such a good decision that even when they do it on television, it's getting that same reaction.
Oh, that is incredible.
I think it's the best thing DC's put to film in a long, long time.
I agree. I think between the Netflix series and the Audible series, which is amazing.
Yes.
As a Sandman fan, I personally, I would never expect anything to ever be as good as the comics, but we live in an age where it's happening.
I think what it is if you like the comics best, great. If you like the TV series best, great. If you like the Audibles best, great, because it's all that same atmosphere, and it's how those things touch you. I feel if that's something that you can achieve, then you've done it. And none of us knew. Certainly not. We were just happy that it would go on another month. You have a job another month. When the sales really kicked into gear, Neil didn't have to worry anymore that that they might cancel you. You got to remember that was coming up when Marvel was doing stuff with McFarlane and Lee, and they were seeing these huge sales. So it was affecting what other people thought their bottom line should be. And if they look at a gothic guy who looks like, a Bauhaus singer, they're not going to say, hey, we want a guy who's killing and stabbing and jumping and all that, not a guy who's quietly talking about philosophical things in a Shakespearean voice. That's just not how you go and break into that kind of Image Comics thing. But all these years later, Sandman's still around, and it was because of its unique vision. And Karen Berger gets a lot of credit for that. She really stuck to this thing and really shielded it. Much as I owe Danny O'Neill, I owe Karen, because she let me, certainly on Calliope, right out of the gate, she let me draw it the way I saw
it. Finally, I just want to ask you, if there's any young people out there watching this now thinking, I want to get into comics, or I want to get into some form of creative form, and they're watching you and you're thinking, you've done it, what advice have you got for them?
I would say this is the best time to do it. And because you don't have to just necessarily, when I was doing it was Marvel or DC. There was no Dark Horse, there was no Image, there was nothing else. I would also say there was no independent ability for you to go directly to people and just make your own comics. And you can do that now. What you have to do is not try to figure out what people like, figure out what you like, and be sincere in that. And if you do that, it will happen. It's not, it could, it's not maybe, it will. And you don't know who will see it. But I would say whether you write or draw, this is the time to do it. I mean, it's a lot more wide open than when I was coming up. And I think that certainly for me, you don't have to, again, I do not worry about the things that typically people worry about when they do comics. I always I'm more just the ideas, and I think there's no way someone coming up now cannot make a connection with a whole God knows how big audience, because you're not going through a filter anymore. And it doesn't matter what one editor's or one company's opinion is of you. That changes all the time. Those guys come and go. So, and I don't, I mean, I never lived on the thing like, oh, somebody didn't like what I did or somebody did like what I did. I always, in fact, the worst thing that can happen to you is somebody you work for loves what you're doing and you're hating it.
Yeah.
That's the worst thing. I've had people I'm working with go, and I go, that's fine. Because that doesn't deter me at all. I don't get energy from that. So I would tell a young person, do it. Be the guy that's happy with it, no matter what anyone else thinks. And this is the time for people to see it.
Very wise words. Thank you very much, Kelley. You've made me very happy.
Well, this was a lot of fun, Graham. It was very good. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it as well. Hi guys, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed that. I certainly did. If you want to support Kelley Jones, one thing I would recommend is getting the DC Universe app on Android and iPhones and iPads. It's really good. You can read thousands and thousands and thousands of comics on there by DC. It's all, you pay a subscription. It's like Netflix but for comics, and it's all DC, and almost everything's on there. If you do get it, I would recommend checking out his Elseworlds books from the very early 90s. I don't have the printed editions to hand at the minute, but it's his first Batman work. It was really good. I would also recommend his 3-year run on Batman with Doug Mensch, which are collected over these 2 hardcovers. Really, really nice, standard sized. I would assume that if you do read it on DC Universe, if enough people read it on DC Universe, DC will pay attention and they might release it in a nice big hardcover omnibus like one of these ones here. That run deserves to be in one big book like that. It's a tremendous run, really, really worth reading. It's very much like his Elseworlds books, but it's its own thing. It's not. The 90s get a bad rap for over convoluted events and crossovers and stuff like that. It's a lovely run, self-contained, beautiful artwork, very well written. Cannot recommend it highly enough. It's incredible. If you're a Batman fan, you need to read it. I would also recommend Gotham After Midnight, which was recently released in this standard sized hardcover by Eagle Moss, who sadly filed for bankruptcy recently. The book is relatively cheap to get a hold of. Again, it's all on DC Universe. It's really, really worth getting it. It's a limited series, 12-pack limited series from 2008 to 2009. Really, really worth reading it. It's great. Please do. Lastly, I would recommend Kings of Fear, which is a much more recent one. I want to say 2016. I can't remember. Stunning artwork. It's only quite short. It's very cheap on Amazon still, and it's also on DC Universe if you don't want to check it out on there. I would also recommend reading Sandman. If you want to read one particular Sandman story, then feel free. But it's an epic story from start to finish. One of the best comics of all time. Kelley Jones's contributions to the comic are incredible, but the entire series is perfect. If you want to support the TV series, I highly recommend you check it out on Netflix. As we touched on in the interview, it's not actually been greenlit for a second series yet, so the viewing figures do matter. If you've not seen it yet, or you've not seen it on Netflix yet, please subscribe to it, please watch it. Hopefully we'll get a second series. I'm sure we will, but if Neil Gaiman's concerned, that tells me we need to watch it. So if you want to support it, please watch it. Best way you can watch it. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.